with us today, and we know there's others still on their way here. We made it back safely from Florida. Myself and Dan got back on Thursday morning, and the others got back on Thursday afternoon. Later on in the service, we'll be hearing a short testimony from those that were over at Single Vision Conference over in St. Petersburg, Florida. We had a great time. After which 4 of the guys, 5 of us guys actually went up on a road trip from Florida all the way up to Atlanta, onward to Charlotte, back down through Savannah, and back down to Florida. And we stayed alive over 1,500 miles, speaking at 2 churches with Dan Brown in close proximity the entire time, without managing to do any damage to him. And so we're thankful for the great time we had over there, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on in our service. If you have your Bible, I turn to Genesis chapter 40. Genesis chapter 40, and if you're able and willing, I'd ask that you'd stand for the reading of God's Word as we open our service with a scripture reading and a word of prayer. Genesis chapter 40, verse number 20, and we'll be going down to the first verse in chapter 41. It says in Genesis 40, verse 20, it says, "And it came to pass the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river." We want to preach a message a little later in the service on those verses entitled "The Wilderness Period." And may God add a blessing to the reading of His Word. We will open our service to the Lord of prayer, and then Brother Dan's going to carry on with us today. Let's pray. I just want to thank you for our time together this morning. I thank you so much for the liberty and the freedom and the privilege that it is to be in your house today. I pray for those that are with us today and those that are still on their journeys here. Lord, I pray for travel and mercies, for safety for them as they come. I pray for the service this morning, that everything that's said, everything that's done, the songs as they're sang, the preaching as it's put forth, Lord, I pray that you would use all that's done in this service today to bring honor to you. That the Christian will be encouraged and uplifted this morning in their walk with you, that we realize that many times you bring in divine periods in our life of rest and waiting and wilderness periods into our lives to teach us and mold us and shape us for your future plans. I pray you encourage us this morning as we gather together as your church here at Chelsea, and may you use this service to magnify your name, encourage the Christian, challenge the lost. For it's your name we pray. Amen.
Well, it's great to see you this Sunday, Chelsea Church. Let's remain stood. We're going to sing our first song, "At Calvary."
There
how deep the Father's love for us, how vast beyond all measure, that he should give his only Son to make a wretch and his treasure. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry, and from the waters lifted me, and saved am I.
When
song of the month for this church, and if you don't know the song or you're not familiar with it, then sing along after we've gone through the first few verses. It's a great song, and I know you guys will really enjoy it. Oh, Wondrous Love.
Until
Tithes and offerings. We're back from our trip to America. We had a phenomenal time. We took over, and from the whole of the UK, about 5 or 6 delegates went over. There was about 209 people that were registered at the conference from across America, some from the Philippines, some from obviously our church, and others across the UK. Many different sessions, both morning sessions, split sessions, evening services. We did a UK versus US soccer match, which you'll be glad to know that the UK beat the US at soccer. After all, it is called football. I don't know why I'm calling it soccer anyway. You're in the UK. I'm still jet lagging getting back into UK speech over US speech. But we won that match. We went to the beach house for a service one night. We did many other incredible activities. And I just thought I would get up. I could have Daniel from the back, Catherine over here, and Dan, if they could come up and join me. I just wanted to ask them a few questions, really. We've got the mic here, just so you can hear them properly. But I just wanted to ask them some questions. If you guys come on up here just to my left, that would be great. So there's going to be 3 questions we're going to ask them, just to give you an idea or a flavour of what the conference was like and what they got out of it. And so there's just questions to give you a glimpse really into what God did that week and why they would encourage you to go next year. If you're a young adult between the ages of roughly 18 and 35, why they would encourage you to come along. And so the first question up on the screen there for you that I'm going to ask them is, what was the biggest thing that God taught you during Single Vision? There's many things they could share. I've asked them to keep it as brief as they can, roughly about a minute each, just to share what God taught them during Single Vision. We'll come to Catherine first, and then you can pass it along there.
So the biggest thing that God taught me during Single Vision was through a message by Pastor Brad Bailey. He preached on doubt, and the lesson that I learned from that message was that, being saved since I was a child, the devil would accuse me that I wasn't actually saved because I didn't have a big testimony of, I had a really rough background, or I was delivered from drugs or something, huge. And he made the point that he's been saved since he was a child, and he's probably sinned more after he's been saved than before he was saved. And I just thought that was very encouraging to hear overall.
So for me, it was a great opportunity to recharge, and the conference was incredible, as it was last year when I went for the first time, and I was convicted by a fair bit of it. There was a variety of different split sessions and preaching that really, it got me, and that wasn't it's not great, but it is great in the long term. I'd say that for me, it was commitment to Bible reading, prayer, and as a student, it was great to hear stuff about financial stewardship and work ethic as well. So I learned an absolute ton from it. I was very convicted by a fair amount of it, so it was a great experience, and I'm very glad to hear this.
It was my first time to Single Vision. It was pretty great. I learned quite a few lessons like work ethic. It's not always have doubts as long as you know how to live. I appreciate the thing I learned the most about us, complacency, and not being too complacent in your Christian life, always striving to get a stronger relationship with God.
Thank you very much, guys. And just so they don't feel like I'm picking on them, I'll answer the questions as well. Is that good? Because otherwise they'll think, man, they're just putting me on the spot. He's not even doing it himself. Is he actually going to do it? But there's a lot of the conference that was very, very challenging, as they've said. I think the main speaker did a phenomenal job every single night. He spoke each of the evening services. His name was Scott Hawley. The first night he preached a message entitled Identity Matters. I'm talking about the root of our Christian life and our faithfulness to God is rooted in the identity that we have in Him. We can't do what we've been called to do until we know who we are and what we are in Him. And so he said, once you know who you are, then you can do what you've been called to do. And so he went into great depth about the importance of knowing that you're in Him, that you have a relationship with Him, and that you're His. And he went back to the Garden of Eden with Adam, and he even went through Genesis chapter 3 and just did a phenomenal job. And that for me was one of the greatest challenges, just remembering that in my Christian life, it's rooted first and foremost in who I am in Him, and that motivates me to live my Christian life. And so I'm thankful for the guys sharing there. There's another question I have for them, and the second one I was going to ask them to share was, what was your favourite session or split session? They may have answered that a little bit, but they're welcome to share some more if they'd like to on that, and why they enjoyed that particular session.
So like Dan has said, I took a lot from everything that was said, but I'm not biased, but the favourite session that I had was like Pastor Stephen. Because it discussed just creative ways of evangelizing. Evangelizing is huge to me, and having the same message conveyed in a different way is good. I always think of new ways to reach people with the gospel. And it was the first time I heard Pastor Steve talk on it, because I hear he brings it up every year when he goes, but I was definitely encouraged.
For me, once again, a split session on financial stewardship and work ethic were two things that I was very much convicted by during the conference, and I think it was great to hear those things. And for me, my favourite preaching of the conference was by a man called Jonathan Blankenship, who preached a sermon on pride, and it was from the passage of Mark chapter 9, 13 to 41. It was talking about basically just Jesus' disciples becoming prideful and how they thought they should be more than they are, and they were becoming prideful as a group. Jesus was stood there like, "What are you doing?" And the disciples were starting to get a bit tense. And it was a really cool take on the whole passage, and I felt I learned a lot from it. It was the 3 points that he made were the stubborn mentalities of Jesus' disciples. It was the internal rivalries that went on between them, and the unhealthy jealousy that they had of other people doing similar work for God. So I thought it was a great take on the whole passage, and it was really, really good to hear.
I'll probably say the one that helped me the most was when I drink water and water ethic, because even though most of the time I'm hard, I say sometimes there's a little bit of doubt in my mind that how it's hard, I shouldn't be, or it's hard, I shouldn't be. Everything. So it's people sometimes, you know, hard working is, but sometimes when they don't feel like it's hard as it should be, putting the effort that it should. That's not a Christian life very much.
You guys, by the way, I did not pay Catherine to say that before the service. She said it on her own accord, I didn't twist her arm. But no, I'm very thankful to the guys. I hope you realise, even just as we were at the conference, there's a lot of very practical sessions. The evening and the mornings are joined together when everybody, all the delegates come together, and one of the pastors or speakers will preach. And then in the split sessions, it's more like teaching. You have lessons on financial stewardship, on relationships, on preparing for marriage, on the early years of marriage, and other things like that. One's on pride, one's on sport, and just various areas that are very, very applicable. And for me, I think the second night, Pastor Paulie preached a message on Eleazar, the man that was sent out by Abraham to go and fetch a wife for his son Isaac. And he talked about the journey that he went on, that he could trust completely, to obey immediately, to act quickly, and to trust humbly in God. And he just went through 7 incredible points of just our dependence upon God for the journey he's taken us on to fulfill what he would have for us to fulfill. So for me, that second night, Pastor Paulie was very, very good, very, very applicable, and very helpful. Last one I just wanted to think about is this here. It says, why would you encourage others to go to Single Vision next year? So Dan has been before, this is his second year. For Catherine and Daniel, it's both their first year. Daniel's passport, I think it only arrived like 6 days before your flight. So I'm very thankful Daniel was able to make it. And Catherine, she was there for the first time. She'd been in America before, but never been to Single Vision. And for Daniel, it was his first time to America as well. So I just wanted to share why they would encourage you to go next year.
I'd say that there are many reasons, but I think the principal reason is just there's nothing in this world like American Baptists. We really need to go just for that, because it was just an encouragement to be there and to have that fellowship across the pond. I mean, they're one of a kind, and you know, they need you, we need them, and we're just part of it. It just reminded me that we're part of a huge global family, and it was just an encouragement. For example, I made sure that I made this gospel cartoon and took it before I went, and I took it over, and a couple of the pastors, I'm embarking now on translating it into different languages with the help of some of the pastors there for the benefit of people all around the world in different missions. So that's it's just an encouragement, and then if you can, definitely go.
It's phenomenal. I like you seeing Catherine had the opportunity to go, and she loved it. And it's yourself and, as you heard, 200 other young adults spending a week together learning and developing their walk with Christ, and that's an amazing thing. It's a great opportunity to see the stuff that goes on in a different country, and as well as it being really fun and you doing all sorts of stuff. I mean, I got to go karting. Go-karting is so fun. But other than that, there's split sessions. There's tons, like Steve said, tons of practical things that you can learn, and there's nothing better than just conferences are always fantastic times to be together. And if you want to come, start saving and register. Yeah, I promise you won't regret it at all.
All the many activities like go-karting, beach house, swimming, all that stuff. I pray the most important thing why you should do this. Because a lot of Christians who some people say points of view, and you can learn from experiences as long as and those also a lot of pastors and might teach you future before about it. So it's a great relationship.
Thank you to the guys for sharing that. I'll ask them to head down. Just give them a wee thank you for coming up and sharing. The conference has been on for 7 years now. For those who have been around Chelsea long enough, our previous pastor was Pastor John Anderson, him alongside the pastor in Tampa, Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida. They co-hosted together. Pastor John did it when he was here, before he then transitioned back to Georgia area in America. And so it's been going on for 7 years now. It means a lot to me. I've made nearly every major life decision in my life over the past 7 years in that building, in that church where the conference is held. I met my wife there the first year. Just a shout out to Dan. I found a wife the first time. You struck out twice. No pressure. Third strike in a row. But no, I met Julia there the first year. I went back every other year. I made the decision to move up to London and to be part of Pastor John's church that first year. I made the decision whether to take over the church when Pastor John went away. I made many other big life choices in that conference, and I find every single year it's just a great time to get away, to recharge spiritually. And as Daniel said, actually, I think the most encouraging thing is to gather alongside other young adults that are in your age and your stage of life that are dealing with the same things that you're dealing with. I think we have this idea, and this is where we do a bit of preaching before the sermon, but I think we have this idea when we come into a church that everybody's perfect. The person beside you is not perfect. The person sitting in your chair isn't perfect. All of us struggle, all of us battle, all of us find it hard to do right all the time, and it's just really good to know. It's weird about the human condition, but it's really good to know that you're not alone in the struggle. And so going there, just getting alongside other young adults to keep you accountable, to encourage you, and to come alongside you was just phenomenal year after year to make those relationships and to build those friendships. And so we just encourage you strongly. If you're a young adult, you can be young married, young single, we'd encourage you to join us next year. The flights, if you book them at the right time, are about 360 to 400 costs. It's just a phenomenal time. It's well worth the value of going there for your spiritual benefit. So that's our Single Vision Conference, and thank you to Catherine, to Daniel, and to Dan for coming along, and also for sharing what God did during that week. But that's the gents to come forward now and we'll receive this morning's offering. Let's pray together for that. Lord, I pray for this service today as we come to this tithes and offerings portion of our service, that as we look back, we can see your goodness. We can see your grace and your mercy and your love and all that you've done for us. And Lord, it's overwhelming when we count your goodness to us, in spite of us many times and who we are without you. Lord, out of the goodness of yourself to us, Lord, we give back to you now that portion that's rightfully yours. We pray you would multiply it and use it to the furtherance of your kingdom in this place. For it's your name we pray. Jerry for that. We went to children and we went to the junior church today. And for us up here, if you have your Bible there, turn to Genesis chapter 40. Genesis chapter 40. I'm so thankful for each person that's here, for the guys that spoke just a minute ago. It encourages me to see the development year by year. I'm thankful for God bringing Catherine to our church just about 6 months ago, maybe slightly more. For Daniel, Daniel's a veteran now. Daniel's been here since 2011. He's been here a long time, and then Dan came along a couple of years ago. He's got 1 year left at university, and for every one of you, I'm so thankful for your commitment to our church, and we're looking forward to what God has for us in the weeks that lie ahead. We're looking today at Genesis chapter 40, and we want to take time to look at a character that personally is one of my favorites. Definitely in the Old Testament, one of my favorite characters in the Old Testament is the man called Joseph. We read the scripture passage at the start of the service. We're going to zone in on a specific portion of his life, but really, in all honesty, we can spend over 20 weeks going through the life of Joseph. Movies have been directed about him, songs and theatres and musicals have been penned, there's many books that have been written about his life. We could spend much time going through scene by scene the life of Joseph. We went through through his life in Measure Tree, looking at all the different portions of his life and all the things he went through, and really, you look at his life,
if you had put yourself in the story, it would have been a roller coaster life to live. There was many highs and many lows, many good times, many bad times, many moments where life was in his control, and many times where life was simply out of his control. Just to give you his life in a snapshot, in phrases, if you will, as we go through his life, we see the favored son, the coat of many colors, the jealous brothers as a result of the father's favoritism. We see unfair treatment from his brothers. We see him being thrown into the bottom of a pit. We see him being sold off into slavery. We see him in Potiphar's house, and yet while he's sold off to slavery as a 17-year-old boy, we see a man that is completely faithful to God as God is faithful to him. We see the temptations of Potiphar's wife. We see the unfair and unjust imprisonment as a result of those false allegations. We see the interpretation of dreams. The butler and the baker in that prison, they had their dreams, and Joseph interpreted it for them. We see the forgotten years in that prison cell. We see the interpretation of Pharaoh's dreams. He's finally brought before Pharaoh into the palace in Egypt, and he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh. He succeeds in having a rapid promotion, second in charge of the entire land. We see him go through the 7 years of plenty. We see the 7 years of famine. We see the reunion with his brothers after a long story of just all that went on. We see him finally reconnect with the brothers, reunited with his father. And through it all, we see the purpose of God in saving much people alive through the famine, through Joseph's testimony and through his faithfulness. That's literally a snapshot, if you will, of some of the key events in Joseph's incredible life. A man that was entirely faithful to God, and God was faithful to him. Someone that relied on God, and God was always with him throughout the journey. We see a man in whom nothing negative was said. One of the few characters in the Bible where there's nothing overtly negative or sinful or a wrong action that's said about Joseph. Many other characters, we see their flaws. We see David's, we see Solomon's, we see Samson's, we see all their flaws. But there's very little negative said about this man, Joseph. We want to zone in on just one portion of his life today, just to take a short time. I'll take as short as I can this morning, bearing in mind we've already had all the testimonies and the pre-sermon sermons there in those testimonies. But I want to preach today on Genesis chapter 40, looking at a message entitled, The Wilderness Period. If you look on the screens there, Genesis chapter 40, verse 20, you can follow along in your pew Bible or on the screens today. It says in Genesis 40, verse 20, "And it came to pass the third day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast unto all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. And he restored the chief butler unto his butlership again, and he gave the cup into the hands of Pharaoh. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river." We want to preach on the wilderness period for the next 30 minutes or so as we make God's word entirely relevant, very applicable to what's going on in our lives in the 21st century. I want to take some time to pray, and then we'll delve into our text this morning. Let's pray. Father, I just want to thank you so much for our time together this morning. I thank you for the privilege it is to open your word. I thank you that it still is alive, it's still breathing, it still speaks into our lives, Lord, yet thousands of years on from when it was written. Lord, I thank you that it's still powerful to change lives. It's still powerful to encourage us in our Christian life. For those of us in here that know him as Savior, Lord, I pray that your word would edify this morning, that it would build us up, that it would encourage us, that, Lord, sometimes you put the pause button in our lives. Sometimes you just hold us back for just a minute. You put us in a waiting room, if you will, to teach us and to mold us and to shape us and to ready us for what you would have for us to do for your honor and glory. Lord, I thank you for Joseph's life. I thank you for his testimony. I thank you that we can learn so much from it. And I pray for these next few moments you'd help me to decrease, that you might increase, and we'll give you the glory for what you're going to do. For it's in your name we pray. Amen. We come to Genesis 40, and we come right in the middle of a big story. So for those that aren't as familiar with the life of Joseph, I'll just give you a bit of a background. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. He entered into the house of a man called Potiphar. Potiphar, he served him faithfully. He was put in charge of everything that was in the house. Potiphar had said he didn't need to care for anything that was in the house because it was under Joseph's hand, and he trusted Joseph. One day came to pass, and Potiphar's wife made moves on Joseph, if you will, or tried to tempt Joseph to do things that he shouldn't do. And long story short, Joseph resisted. False allegations were made by Potiphar's wife to Potiphar about Joseph and what he supposedly did, which he never did. And as a result of that, he's thrown into a prison cell. He would call this a dungeon in Genesis chapter 40. It's not a pleasant experience. Unfair and unjustly, he's been thrown into this prison. And while he's there, a few months into that prison time, Pharaoh has a disagreement or a falling out with his two chief of staff, the one that prepares his food and the one that prepares his drink, the butler and the baker. He has some sort of disagreement. The Bible doesn't tell us what, but whatever happened was bad enough that he wanted them thrown into prison. They end up in the same prison cell as Joseph. Joseph is sensitive, even in a state where really he doesn't deserve to be there. He's been treated unjustly and unfairly. You could forgive him for being bitter, but yet in the midst of all of that, he's still sensitive to God. Sensitive enough to see that the butler and the baker are having a hard time. And one day, he sees them incredibly distressed, and he goes to them and asks them what the problem is. They tell him that they've had a dream the previous night, but that there's nobody to interpret it for them. Joseph goes on to interpret both their dreams, and the essence of their dreams is this. He says to the butler, he says, in 3 days, the Pharaoh's going to remember you. He's going to restore you to your previous position. But the baker, in 3 days, you're going to die at the hands of the Pharaoh. Butler, you're going to be restored. Baker, you're going to pass away. After he's interpreted their dreams, Joseph makes a request in Genesis chapter 40, verse 14. He says in Genesis 40, verse 14, after he said to the butler that he's going to be restored to his previous position, he says to this man, he says, but think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. Notice the way he talks about this prison experience. He says, for indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing wrong that they should put me in this dungeon. He says, I don't deserve to be here. It's like a dungeon. It's a miserable experience. You're going to be restored in 3 days. And when you're restored, I encourage you, I implore you, I long that you would remember me whenever you stand before the Pharaoh. The main crux of our message comes from Genesis 41, verse 1. Just 2 small words, or 3 small words, in Genesis 41, verse 1. The butler's restored. Chapter 41 starts. And it says in chapter 41, it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed and stood by the river. Pharaoh has a dream, and it says there's a time gap or a time jump between the end of chapter 40 and the start of chapter 41 of 2 whole years. He's asked the butler, he said, I want you to remember me. Think well on me when you're restored to service. Remember where I'm at. Remember that I'm here unjustly. Remember my plight. And implore the Pharaoh to do something about it. He's the most powerful man in the world. If anybody can get me out of this prison experience, it's him. The butler is restored to service. For whatever reason, the Bible doesn't tell us. It says he simply forgot about Joseph. And for 2 whole years later, finally, he would remember him as Pharaoh has his dream. I want to put a figure up on the board for you. The figure is 1,051,200. That figure is the number of minutes that ticked by in 2 whole years that Joseph remained in prison. Now, I've not known this from personal experience, but from what I hear, prison time goes by pretty slowly. There's not a massive amount to do. You're in confinement. You're in a solitary place. You're in a place where really you can't do or fulfill what you want to do or fulfill. And time just seems to drag by when you're there, according to others that I've heard, of course. We come to Joseph, and Joseph's there for 2 entire years. From the time he makes his plea to the butler to the time he's remembered. It equates to over 1 million minutes that Joseph watched day and night for 2 entire years tick by. If you could put Joseph's life into book form, you would call this chapter of his life the forgotten years. The years where he's out of the limelight, out of the spotlight. He's not where he wants to be, not where he desires to be, not doing what he wants to be doing. You could call it God's waiting room. For many of us, we've had those times, haven't we? And it may not take the form of a prison, but for all of us, it feels like sometimes God just puts our life on hold. That we know what God has for us, we know the next steps we want to take, we know what we want to fulfill with the life we've been given, whether it's in our workplace, in our families, in our church, in Christian service, and it just feels like we want to press on, but for some reason, it feels like life is on hold. The Bible doesn't tell us anything about these 2 whole years. It stands chapter 40 of the prison experience for Joseph. It starts chapter 41 2 years later. We don't know anything that happened. We don't know any events in Joseph's life during these 2 years. But from the events that follow, we can tell very clearly that these 2 years had a massive impact on the life of Joseph. The man that came and stood before Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 41 is a man whose life was entirely centered on God, whose mind was focused on him. He wasn't bitter, he wasn't angry, he wasn't jealous, he wasn't vengeful. He was a man that desired to do what God had called him to do. And God did something in his heart in these 2 years. Chuck Swindoll, I don't know if many of you know of him, he's a writer and a pastor over in America. He does an incredible book series on biographies of Christian characters, Bible characters. He's done one on David, on Joseph, on Jesus, on Paul, on many others. And in every single character, he makes this statement. He says, every great character in the Bible that was greatly used by God went through their wilderness period. We would call it maybe God's waiting room. We could call it the forgotten years. He uses the term the wilderness period. And for every great Bible character that would be greatly used by God, before they fulfilled all that God would have them to do, they all had this experience. Not all of them took the form of a dungeon or a prison, but all of them had some form of waiting, some form of a wilderness period. You think about it, and in your sermon notes there, you can see, we don't have time to go through them all, but you can see some of the names that experienced their own wilderness period. You think about Moses. Moses was a man that God would use in a great way. At 80 years old, he would go back to Egypt, and he would lead a rebellion to take the Israelites out of Egypt and lead them to the brink of the promised land. Before he would do that, you know what Moses did from the age of 40 to the age of 80? For 40 entire years, after murdering the Egyptian in Egypt, he ran for his life to a place called Midian. He served Jethro in the backside of the desert as a shepherd, out of the spotlight, where he was once a prominent man in Egypt. Now he's a nobody, serving sheep and serving his father-in-law for 40 entire years, and time just seems to tick by. His 40-year wilderness period, after which he would be greatly used by God. You think about Elijah. Elijah took the form of under a juniper tree. He spent 40 days in Mount Horeb, where he wrestled with whether God was there and whether God was still using him and whether God was still wanting to do something through his life. After which he would come out of that place in Mount Horeb. He would raise the Shunammite woman's son from the dead. He would do many incredible deeds. He would live an incredible life, but he had 40 days in his wilderness in Mount Horeb. You think about David. David had a number of wilderness periods. David was anointed the future king of Israel. And you know what happens in the very next scene? You've been anointed. The prophet of God comes and says, let's use Jerry as our example. He says, Jerry/David, you're going to be the next king of Israel. You know what happens in the next scene in Jerry's life, David's life? He's back in the shepherd's field tending sheep. He's out doing what he did exactly before. Tomorrow is no different than yesterday in David's life. It's just that he knows one day he's going to be the future king. He was back tending sheep for his father. Eventually, David would come out of that field, Saul would call for somebody that could play the harp. And whenever he goes seeking for somebody to play the harp, he finds David. And where is David when Saul comes looking? He's in the father's field tending the sheep. He goes and plays the harp for the king, and then the next chapter he's back in the shepherd's field again. And then his father comes to him in that shepherd's field and says, son, I want you to go and check on your brothers and see how they're doing in the battle. And David went to check on the brothers, and you know what happens. He goes and he has one of the most defining moments in his life. He defeats the Philistine giant Goliath. You know what happens after that? He's promoted into Saul's army. But after that, Saul gets jealous. Saul gets bitter. And David would enter into another wilderness period. He knows he's going to take over as king one day. He knows that Saul's not going to be on the throne for long. Saul gets jealous. He throws spears at David. And yet after all of that, David goes back and he's on the run for his life from Saul in caves in Adullam and En Gedi and many others all across the wilderness. And he's running for his life for a number of years. His own personal wilderness period. We see it in Moses. We see it in Elijah. We see it in David. We see it in Paul. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 17 and 18, you don't need to turn there, but it says in Galatians 1 about Paul, it says, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and returned again unto Damascus. Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. Paul spent, after he got saved, he has that incredible conversion experience on the road to Damascus. And we see after that experience, he's led away for 3 years into his own wilderness period. The Arabian desert, where he would meet with Jesus and be taught by Jesus about what it means to be the apostle to the Gentiles. We come to Jesus. Jesus had his own literal wilderness period. 40 days being tempted daily by Satan. He would come out of that and then fulfill the rest of his earthly ministry. He would die on the cross. He would raise from the dead. We see every character that was greatly used by God, they all had this time. They all had that waiting moment. They all had that wilderness time where they were being tested and tried and refined and purged. And Joseph was no different. We see in Genesis 41 verse 1, he's there in that prison cell watching over 1 million minutes tick by, and God is using this wilderness time, this wilderness period, to refine his man for what's to come. Every one of these characters did their greatest works of their lives after that wilderness time. Joseph, I permit to say this morning, he would not have been ready for the palace if he didn't go first through the prison and the pit. And for you in your life, the palace maybe represents for you all that God has for you, all that God wants for you, all he wants to do through your life, but you're not ready for that until God's first refined you and purged you and shaped you through the prison and the pit moments of life. Every great character has them. You imagine Joseph, how different he would have been if his brothers had never betrayed him and sold him into slavery. If he'd been still that favored son in the father's household, grown up with a silver spoon in his mouth, never went through the pit moments of life, never went through this prison experience, he would never have been the same man that we see come out of this prison experience in Genesis 41, verse number 1. For us in our lives, the question isn't whether these wilderness periods will come. For all of us, they're going to come. The question in our Christian life is, how are we going to steward those moments in life? Are we going to get bitter about them? Are we going to get angry? Are we going to wallow in self-pity? Joseph could have done that. Are we going to trust God? Are we going to have a godly attitude? In our trials, in our valleys, in our waiting time, in our wilderness period, how are we going to steward those moments of life? If you think through your life so far, maybe you can look back and you can see them already. If you don't have them yet, I promise you they're coming. All of us have those wilderness moments where we look at God and we sort of say this to ourselves: I don't understand why God is doing this. It just isn't the way I planned it. I just wish I could get from this stage to the next stage. I could transition into the next area of service. I want to fulfill my potential of what I feel I can do for God, yet it feels like my life's on pause. It feels like God's forgotten about me. It feels like I've been put on the shelf while God's using others in a great way. We've all felt that at various times. We look at others' life and they seem to be moving forward and progressing and doing great acts for God, and it seems like we're spinning our wheels. It feels like our life has been put on pause. We've all felt like that. Maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's a job, an area of Christian service. Maybe it's a gifting that God's given you that you're not able to fully use just yet, or a calling to which He's called you that you haven't been able to step into yet because God has not permitted it. a next step you need to take in your Christian life, but for some reason God is making you wait until His timing to take it. In those times, it's very easy to be left feeling frustrated, underused, underappreciated, undervalued, or abandoned. It's very easy to feel all of those things. It's never easy to wait. And the waiting room of God can be one of the hardest places to be in our Christian life. The wilderness periods of life can feel like the lowest and the most unproductive moments in our Christian life. But here's the truth today, and this is where we're going with all of this. It's in God's waiting room that He does His greatest preparatory work. It's in God's waiting room that He does His greatest preparing work. And for us today, in those wilderness periods of life, those are the moments where God readies His man or His woman for His work. David could not have had the throne without having the fields and the caves. You think about Moses. Moses couldn't have been the leader he was without that desert experience in Midian. Paul could not have been the church planter and Christian pioneer that he was without first going through his Arabian desert. And Joseph certainly couldn't have stood before the most powerful man in the land, centered on God entirely, if he didn't first go through the prison and through the pit. Here's the deal, friends, and these are two key truths. If you forget about everything today, take these thoughts away with you. In the Christian life, you cannot have the product without the process. You cannot have the product without the process. And secondly, before God does a work through someone, He must first do a work in someone. Before God works through someone, He must first do a work in someone. And for every single great man and woman of God in the Bible, we see God first working in that person and then working through them behind the scenes in those moments in their life. The moments out of the spotlight, the screen, the scenes in our lives, which seems where we've been put on hold and only God and us can see what's happening in our lives. The wilderness periods and the waiting room of God. And it's through those long, seemingly insignificant periods, such as Joseph's 2 years here in Genesis 40, where God does His greatest work. A preparing work, a readying work, a refining work, a sharpening work to prepare us for His purpose and for His use. A work that can never be done in the busyness of life. He's got to strip back things to do the work. It can't be done in the spotlight. It must be done behind the scenes. It's moments where He prepares us to enter into all that He wants to do through our lives. We cannot skip the process. In the classroom of God, there's no skipping class. I don't know about Daniel. Daniel's been doing his GCSEs, and I know from my personal experience in school, it's very easy if you want to skip class, isn't it, Daniel? You can skip class if you want. That's the choice that you have. But it doesn't work that way in the Christian life. You can't skip classes in God's classroom. You can't skip stages in God's process. And one of the stages that God uses as part of His process to get you to the place where you can enter into all He wants to do through your life is this wilderness period. We don't like the wait. We live in a society where we like to fast track and shortcut the process, don't we? That's why we have microwaves. That's why we have fast food. That's why we have the lines in the theme parks, like over in Disney, where you can pay extra to go on the fast track line so you don't have to stand in queue. That's why you have the fast forward button on your Virgin remote or your Sky remote, because you don't want to sit there and watch the adverts. We were sitting last night, and Julia's sitting there, and we turned on a TV show, and we sat there for probably 2 minutes, didn't we? And Julia turned to me and was like, is this not like recorded already? Can we not skip through all this? Why are we sitting watching this? You know, we have this thing in society where like we just don't want to wait. We want to get to where we're going. We want to shortcut the process. We want to fast track the whole deal to where we can get through it all. That's why we have pot noodles, as all the students know. We have all of this because we like shortcutting the process. We like cutting corners wherever possible. But in the Christian life, it doesn't work. In the spiritual realm, there's no shortcutting the process of God. There's no fast-tracking it. For all of us, we must go through God's process to get the product. You cannot have the product without the process. And for us in our Christian life, those wilderness times, they will come. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And when they come, will we trust in God? Will we leave it in God's hand, trusting that He knows best, that His timing is perfect? We come to Joseph, and Joseph was a man in this experience that we can see he trusted God. He saw His hand and His presence in all of it. And in that time, through those 2 years, we see a man come out the other side that was sharper, more refined, more God-centered than anything that went into that prison. We come to the main portion of our message, and we just want to fly through these. These are the applications today for you to take away. 5 thoughts whenever you're going through your wilderness time. It can be difficult. It can be discouraging. It can be frustrating. But in those times, there's some important truths to remember. The first truth is this. Whenever you're frustrated, whenever you're in that wilderness time, remember that God's timing is greater than your timing. God's timing is greater than your timing. We see in Genesis 41 verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh dreamed, and behold, he stood by the river." So there's that 2-year gap where previously Joseph had requested unto the butler, he said, "Make mention of me on the Pharaoh." So here's the time frames. Joseph's timing would have been this: I want out of here ASAP. I want out of here yesterday. I want to be out of here as soon as that butler gets before Pharaoh. The first thing he should remember is what I did for him so I can get out of this dungeon. That's Joseph. God, however, is very different. God's idea, God's timing, God's plan for Joseph was a 2-year wait. A 2-year time in that prison cell where God would ready his man, would have him in the right place at the right time for the right purpose. You think about all that came to pass after that. You think of all that Joseph would have missed out on if he had got his timing and his way. He would have been out of his mind the day that the butler got out of prison. He would have been back with his father and his brothers over in Israel. He would have been free man, and he would have been back celebrating freedom. But 2 years later, Pharaoh still would have had a dream. The 7 years still would have come of famine, and somebody would have had to prepare for them. But God's man would not have been in the right place at the right time to fulfill God's purpose if Joseph had got his way. In our lives, oftentimes, I'm sure you've looked at your life and thought, man, I wish things would slow down. I wish things would speed up. I wish I could move on to the next stage. I wish I could go back to the previous one. In my timing, in my mind, with my ideas and my plans, this is the way I think things should play out. And this is the time frame in which I want to do it. What you find as you go through life is, and as a Christian in God's Word, God's timing is always better than yours. God's timing is always better than yours. And you can rush through this life. You can do life your way. You can push through doors that God hasn't opened. But if you do that, you will never see God's best. You'll never see His greatest plan and His greatest desires for your life when you do it your way. You can choose your timing. You can force your will. But you're going to miss out on all that God has. Joseph wouldn't have been in the right place at the right time for the right moment when Pharaoh had that dream if he had had his timing instead of God's. You think secondly about this. This is so important to remember. When you're in your wilderness time and you're waiting for God to move and your life's on pause, sometimes it's very easy to feel like God's forgotten about you. It's important to remember in that time it doesn't take God by surprise. God knows where you're at. He knows what you're going through. It doesn't take Him by surprise that you're in that waiting time or in that wilderness period. In fact, at the end of Genesis 39, Daniel, could you bring up Genesis 39, verse number 23? It's the last verse in Genesis 39. Joseph has just come into prison. He's just been made head over all that's in that prison. And look at what it says in this verse. It says, "The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper." Let me ask you this. Was God with Joseph in the prison? Absolutely He was. It says it right there in the verse. He was there with him in the Father's house. He was there with him in the pit as his brothers sold him into slavery. He was there as that 17-year-old boy was uprooted from his home. Everything was left behind. He was sold to the Midianite traders. He was sold into Potiphar's house, and yet God was still with him then. And as Joseph went through this prison experience, one thing he never lost sight of was the fact that God was still there. God was still with him every step of the way. And in our wilderness moments, we must remember God has not forgotten about us. God still loves us. God is still there. And when Joseph was in prison, he knew the presence of God. Whenever David was in the shepherd's field, ordained as the future king of Israel, he still trusted that God was there. And for you in your wilderness period, please remember, God is not done with you. He isn't forgotten about you. He still loves you, and He's still working in your life. We see that one of the important things to remember is it doesn't take God by surprise. Number 3, one of the most important truths. In your wilderness time, there's a purpose for the wait. There's a purpose. It's not like God has brought this time to punish you or to frustrate you or to shelve you whenever you could be used by Him. No, God is working a purpose and a plan in the midst of the entire waiting period. We can look at the verses again just for time's sake, but it says there again, remember, Joseph wants out ASAP. He wants to get out. He says, "Make mention of me to the Pharaoh. He forgets about him for 2 entire years. I wonder what would have happened if the butler had remembered him. The butler remembers him. He comes before the most powerful man in the land, who previously had disliked him so much he threw him in prison the first time. No doubt the butler was a little scared to be making requests on day one. Maybe he talks to him, maybe he doesn't. If he talked to the Pharaoh, maybe Pharaoh would have cared, maybe he wouldn't have cared. Maybe he would have looked favorably upon Joseph, or maybe he wouldn't. The Bible doesn't tell us anything about that, because that's not the way the story played out. The way the story did play out is that the Pharaoh would have a dream 2 years later. The butler's there. Pharaoh's frustrated. Nobody in the land can tell him the interpretation of the dream. And the butler finally remembers, I believe it was a divine memory that God gave him of Joseph in that prison cell, the right man in the right place at the right time for the right moment to interpret the Pharaoh's dream. The butler says, there's this guy in the prison cell. I forgot entirely about him, but I was there with the baker. Remember whenever you disliked us so much, you threw us in prison? Remember that? Whenever we were in prison, I had a dream, and this guy, this Israelite, he remembered us. This Hebrew guy, he interpreted the dream for me. And maybe he can do the same for you. And so Joseph comes in front of the most powerful man in the land. He interprets his dream. He readies this land for the 7 years of plenty, storing away all the food in that period to prepare for that 7 years of famine. To ultimately, as the Bible tells us, save much people alive during the famine. God had a purpose and a plan for the wait. If Joseph had been out of that prison day one, he would not have been where God needed him to be for the moment and the plans that God had for him. He would never have been promoted to second in charge in all of Egypt. He would never have been reunited with his brothers and his fathers in such a dramatic fashion. All of that would never have come to pass, and many would have died in the famine if the plan of God had not come to pass. I want you to think about it this way, but imagine if one event in your life happened just a little differently. How different your entire life would be. You look back at pivotal moments. I can look back at pivotal moments in my life where I can tell that God divinely detoured my life to bring me to where I am today. And you look back and you think, what if that had never happened? Where would I be today? I think about my life, and not that whatever, but I just want to share a little bit of my story. At 16 years old, the thing that started off my entire process of standing here today, it sounds ridiculous, but it's true. I was on a football pitch at 16 years old, playing a preseason football match against a guy that was about twice my weight and twice my age. We went in for a tackle, and it didn't end well for the smaller guy. I tore 2 sets of ankle ligaments. I quit playing football. I couldn't play at that level anymore. I was playing 5 times a week over in Northern Ireland. I had to cut that aside because I just couldn't play anymore. At that time, I couldn't see why. It was probably an idol in my life, to where really I was so focused on that I wasn't giving God as much time as I should. And I look back now and I can see a divine ligament tear, if you will. I can see God divinely stepping in to where now I have all of this free time that I'm not using, that I was plowing into football, and I began pouring that into God's church in Northern Ireland. I began serving on a Friday night at a youth club. I began going to Wednesday night Bible study and Sunday night, where previously I was only going on Sunday mornings. I ended up deciding to take a gap year after school instead of going into sports science and university. And during that gap year, God led me over to England and called me to full-time ministry. I moved over here at 18 years old. I lived in Essex for a year and a half, serving an evangelistic ministry over there. God then moved me up to London, where I would then meet Pastor John. I would go to Single Vision, which we talked about. I would meet my wife. We would have our child and another one on the way. I would pastor the church. I'm standing before you on the 2nd of July, 2017. And all of that happened because of one little event. And if that had happened very differently, if I'd never got that injury, I don't know what way my life would look. God divinely appoints moments in your life to bring you to where you are. And some of them take the form of wilderness periods. Some of them take the form of prison experiences. Some of them take the form of football injuries. Some of them take the form of job losses or location changes, or you name it. But God divinely appoints divine detours in your life to fulfill His plan and His purpose. And you look back and you can't see it at the time. Joseph, I'm sure, doubted at the time what God was doing. But as he looks back, he can see the whole picture. He can see, man, I'm so thankful that I didn't get what I wanted. I'm so thankful that I stayed in the prison for that 2 years, because I was in the right place at the right time to fulfill the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream, to save so many people during the famine, to meet my family again and to bring them down into Egypt so we could live in luxury and as a family. And all that wouldn't have happened had God not permitted that wilderness period in my life. God has a plan and a purpose in the midst of all of it. We come to a close. I want to just rush through the last 2, but I want you to think about this. Number 4, in your wilderness time, remember God is shaping you. God is shaping you. We know God was shaping Joseph by the first words that came out of his mouth when he stood before Pharaoh. He was not bitter. He was not envious. He was not jealous. He was not vengeful. His first words before Pharaoh in Genesis 41, verse 16 were these. And Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God shall give Pharaoh an answer of peace. He stands before the most powerful man in the world and he says, Pharaoh, I hate to disappoint you. If you're looking to me for an answer, I can't give it to you. It's not in me. It's all about God. He stood before the most powerful man in the world, and I doubt if it wasn't for the prison experience, if it wasn't for the pit, if it wasn't for these refining moments where God was building his man and shaping his man, he could never have stood in the house of Pharaoh and said, it's not about me, it's all about God. I can't, but God can. It's all about his glory and him getting the honor. We see a man who comes out of this prison experience, this wilderness time, and his heart is entirely centered on God. He's trusting in him. He's relying on him. He's looking to God for the power to serve and to do what he's called him to do. A man who's been molded and shaped through the pit and through the prison to stand before the most powerful man in the world and say, it's all about God. And for you in your wilderness time, remember, God is still working. He's doing a work in your life. And where it seems from a human perspective like one of the most unproductive, one of the most frustrating times in our lives, if we'll steward the wilderness periods, those waiting moments where life is on pause, if we'll steward them for God's glory and trust in him in the midst of it, God can do a work in that period in your life that he can never do at another time. And he's going to prepare you for what comes next. It goes back to that same saying. God first has to do a work in someone before he can do a work through someone. May I ask you, have you given God time in your life to let him do a work in your life so that he can then work through your life? Sometimes we have to take a step back and just take time with God, get alone with him, feast on his word, commune with him in prayer, take time at our own personal pause moment in life and get alone with God and let God do a work in us so that he can then do a work through us. If we don't let him do that, we'll never enter into all he has and all that he wants to do. We need to take that time with God. And usually God will produce a time in your life to do that work, that wilderness or that waiting time. Lastly, and I don't want to say too much about this, but Joseph realized through his wilderness time when God is all that you have, he realized that God was all that he needed. And in that wilderness time, it feels like everything's stripped away. He's sold into slavery. He doesn't have his family. He doesn't have his wealth. He doesn't have his coat of many colors. He doesn't have much. All he has, all that's the same for Joseph as he looks at this portion of his life compared to where he started, is God. The family's different. His position's different. His possessions are different. His status and prestige is different. He was once a favored son. Now he's a slave. And yet in the midst of all of it, God was all he had. And whenever he was in that position, he realized that God was all that he needed. I wish we could take more time today, but I want to close with this. The sixth thought is this. It will come to an end. It will come to an end. You won't be on hold forever. The wilderness time is not going to last your entire life. It's but for a season. It's seasons of life that God brings us through, parts of the process that he brings us through to prepare us for his work. Joseph's took 2 years. Paul's took 3. Moses took 40. Moses was 80 years old before he was ready to do what God had called him to do. We must simply wait upon God, trust in God in the midst of that waiting period and ready ourselves for what God has for us on the other side. The bottom line is that wilderness times will come. They can make or break your Christian life. And in those moments, we must decide, will we trust in him and turn to him, or will we run the other way? Will we see him in the midst of it, or will we forget him? Will we rely on him, or will we run from him? That's the choice we all make. And Joseph stewarded this time in his life for God's glory, trusting in God's hand, and he came out the other side to do probably the crowning work that God would do through his life. And for you, I believe God has the same thing, the same plans, the same process that he wants to do in all of our lives. He wants to work first in us, to then work through us. He wants to go through the process of molding us and shaping us so that we're ready to be that finished product for God to use for his honor and glory. The wilderness period. Let's pray together today. Father God, I just want to thank you so much for our time together today. I thank you for your word. and for your people that are here listening so diligently. Lord, I pray for each of us. Maybe some of us are in that